Welcome to MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 31. I've been speaking in the previous weeks about events in the Middle East, Israel, and one question I think I must open up with is someone asked, what connection do world events, even in Israel, have with MyLife Chassidus Applied? It's a very good question, and I feel I should address it before anything else. Well, firstly, the whole point of Torah and Chassidus, like the Rambam Paskins in the end of Hilchos Chanukah, that Kol HaTorah le'nitna l'laseh shalom ba'olam. The whole Torah was given to bring peace to this world. Torah includes, of course, Chassidus. And those that learn Chassidus and learn the Biyurim that Chassidus talks about how Torah brings peace, it's about not just peace between Ish Le'ehu, friend to another, one person to another, but it's also peace between the world and God, peace between one person and himself or herself. And Chassidus is an integral component in achieving both personal peace and global peace. And as the Rambam there, Paskins, what does he say? Shalom ba'olam. He's bringing it concerning Shalom bayis, concerning peace and harmony at home. So firstly, Chassidus is concerned not just with the individual, but with the world as well. Which is why you'll find, starting from the Untitled Rebbe, who was concerned with events in the world, Mispal, the famous Rosh Hashanah story, how he woke up earlier to blow shofar in order to ensure that Alexander of Russia would win over Napoleon of France, because of the entire reason of France being maybe more physically easier for the Jews, but spiritually would be far more challenging, etc. And all the way to the Rebbe. Al Medina's Boya Omer, we say in Rosh Hashanah, and the Rebbe, we see in many sikhs talking about world events, especially at Yisrael. So it's part of Chassidus too. It's not so-called politics. Torah is not political. Torah is God's will and God's plan for this universe, both individually and collectively. So it definitely fits into Chassidus Applied. Yet at the same time, my life, like another person writes, that I have to deal with my own personal depression. I have to deal with my own challenges. Though I understand the importance of events in the Middle East, events in Eretz Yisrael, and my prayers go out to our brothers and sisters there, but at the end of the day, what does that have to do with my personal well-being? Well, this comes answer number 2 to the question. Elam Kotten Zeh Adam, a fundamental principle in Yiddishkeit in general, in Torah and Chassidus in particular, is the idea of microcosm, macrocosm. The human being is a small universe, a universe in microcosm, and the universe is a large organism. And the way we behave and the way we live our lives personally affects the world, and what happens in the world affects us personally, whether you know it or not. When the Rambam says, for example, so often cited by the Rebbe, that a person has to always see himself as if the entire world, everything is balanced, and that zchuyos, mitzvahs, are equally balanced with, God forbid, the negative. And one act, ma'aseh echad, dibur echad, machshava achas, one thought, one word, one act, can tip the scale. Not just the scale in your own personal life, the scale of the universe. How's that possible? Because besides the fact that every act has its butterfly effect using scientific modern contemporary scientific ideas that a butterfly flaps its wings in Kansas City and it creates a typhoon in Singapore. Besides that, it's also microcosm, macrocosm. Because each of us is a complete universe. And as such, we correspond. Everything in the world corresponds to our actions. And that's why when you do something in your personal life, it affects you and the entire world, and vice versa. Some of us know more of the details of it, and some do not. But to suggest that world events, especially in Eretz Yisrael, which is not just a Jewish land and a holy land, a promised land, it's the interface, the portal between heaven and earth. Zeh Shara Shamayim, this is the gate to heaven. So what events there are absolutely connected to our personal lives, and vice versa. And that's why when the Rebbe spoke about this, and he spoke about how even here in the United States or other places, our behavior and our actions have impact, direct impact on events in Eretz Yisrael. It helps them, strengthen them, reinforce them spiritually, but even physically. And we'll talk more about that a little later in this episode. But I just wanted to open up with this because I don't want to think I'm getting detracted with other subject matter, besides the fact that it's in headlines and it's on our minds, what's going on in Eretz Yisrael and so on, but it's also absolutely related to the heroes and directives of the Rabbeim, and that's why you see most of the Mivtzoim of the Rebbe, most of the campaigns were connected directly to events in Eretz Yisrael. The Mivtzit film began Tavshel Chav Zayin, 1967, Shavuos time, in direct link to the 6-day war, Shmira, protection, V'yoru Mimeka, V'ro Kol Amei Orez, V'yoru Mimeka, the film's power to create strength and build courage and drive fear into the enemy. Ma'alot, which was a tragic terrorist attack in northern Israel, was the provoked Mivtza Mezuzah, another form of Shmira. That was later in 1972, 1973. The Yom Kippur War rise right around then when all the other Mivtzoim began. And then the other Mivtzoim were either directly or almost directly connected to events in Israel. And Mivtzoim are all personal mitzvahs. Tefillin, Mezuzah, Teirah, Bayis Moles Vorim, Zokah. And of course even the bigger ones, Chinuch, Ahavas Yisrael, and then the 3 for the women. Neshek, Taras Mishpocha, and Kasher Shachil V'Shtiyah are all both personal but collective effects. And they're interlinked and always connected. And finally the Mishnah, Chayev Adam Le'er B'Shvili Nivra Elam. Person has to always, why Lifikach Nivra Adam Yechidi, why was Adam Rishon created as an individual, not as part of a herd, part of a group, even part of a bait, as an individual, to teach us that every human being has to always see himself as an individual and feel, not in an arrogant way, but in a humble way and responsible way, that the entire world was created for me, and what am I doing to affect the world around me? So it has to absolutely concern us to understand the events in Eretz Yisrael in the Middle East, including Bnei Yishmael and Bnei Esav and Bnei, of course, Avram, Yitzchak, V'Yakov, and know that our actions make a difference. Our actions make a difference in our personal lives and collectively. And sometimes, actually, when there's a crisis, when there's a challenge, it compels us to rise to the occasion and mobilize ourselves, draft ourselves into the army. As I discussed, there's a spiritual part of the army, there's the physical part of the army, especially by Id. So we have to absolutely see ourselves linked to all these events, and understanding them is not just a nice option. It's incumbent upon us to understand it, to know how to act. And we have, thank God, from the Rebbe and from the Rabbeim before, as I'd already elaborated a bit in the previous episode, the Rebbe Marash's Maimer Matzazu, Tofresh Mem, the letter and answer from the Rebbe to Rabbi Greenglass. You can refer to the last episode, fascinating answer. The Zoyars that were both, that the Rebbe Tzeichen there, and Rabbi Greenglass as well. Seif Parsha V'Eira, Zeir, the end of Parsha V'Eira, in Zeir Chelik Beis, Shmois, and Zeir Chelik Gimel, Seif Parsha Bolok. In addition to the Yalkut Shmeni, about Melech Poras, etc., etc. These are things that are part of Chassidus, part of Torah, and help us understand the world better, understand ourselves personally better. And I want to add one more thing. I keep saying finally, because there's so much to say, so maybe I shouldn't say finally. There's always more, but there's the famous Maimer, and I think I cited it as well, Keil Deidi, from Tovshin Tes. That is actually a Maimer that was from Tofresh Pei Daled, originally published in Tovshin Tes. Friedrich Rebbe wasn't saying Maimorim any longer in 1949. And it's based on a Maimer in Tofresh Samaches, which is 1908, that the Rebbe Rashab said. And these Maimorim, and then the Rebbe Chazed it as well in the 80s, 1980, and then again I believe in 1982 or 83. And the Rebbe, and the theme of the Maimer there is that the last refinement in Golus will be the Bnei Yishmael and Bnei Edom, from Golus Edom and Golus Yishmael. And he talks there, both collectively, the empires that existed, the 4 empires, the famous Cholim of Daniel, and there's the Midrashim that all talk about the 4 great empires. Mitzrayim, of course, is the Reish Kol HaGolius, like Kesed of Klippa. But then he talks about Bovel and about Poros Samoda and Yavon and Edom, which is Rome, and this is the Golus we are in now. But then there's also Golus Yishmael. Commentaries have a whole discussion about whether Yishmael is concluded with Edom or it's two separate. But when you look at Chassidus, including in Shari Tshuva from the Mitteler Rebbe and other places, they definitely talk about that the final bitter will be one with Yishmael, and it's based on the Zoyar. In Shari Tshuva, the Mitteler Rebbe says specifically, brings the Zoyar, which B'Pashtus he means the Zeir at the end of Pasha Ve'era and Pasha Bolog that I referred to. And you see, not so blatant, but you see the choreography. You see the hidden choreography hinted to and sometimes very directly discussed in the Maimar of Chassidus, but it's Bahavla because it's written in a language of Chassidus. So you could you can see it as more of a theoretical thing. But in that Maimar, Tavshin Tes, and the other Maimarim that's based on, he clearly says that Netzach and Hoid is Yishmael and Edom, and our Aved of Netzach and Hoid is what is a counterforce to the Klippa of Netzach and Hoid. As I discussed, Netzach being determination, Hoid being Heidah, acceptance. So even if you don't have Shleimus Hamidus of Chesed, Gvura, and Teferes, like he says in Bossi Legani, Tavshin Yud, the famous Bossi Legani, that the Rebbe would explain and Chazer on every year on Yud Shvat, the Midas HaNetzachen, that is given to the Anoshim Pshutim, which is the Anshe Chayil, the simple front line, the infantry, which is us. You don't have to have Greise Giluyim and Aveda Primis, but the Kabbalah self, Netzachen, the sheer determination to forge ahead, and with Heidah, with an acknowledgement and acceptance, that is the Aveda of our time. So he clearly connects our personal service and our personal health, I'm talking about spiritual health, emotional health, and psychological health, with the welfare of the world. So that is relatively my short answer to the question of how it's all connected to MyLife Chassidus Applied. And Adarab, personal Aveda and personal well-being is directly linked, and if you work on that, that itself is a way of making a contribution and improving and helping the situation as it is today. Okay. With that said, with that introduction, I want to continue some points in this regard. Regarding the Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Neach, I spoke about non-Jews. There were a number of questions about our attitude, our interacting with Umas Ha'elam, as we put it, the nations of the world. The relevance today couldn't be more relevant because look what's going on. You have a world that's tumbling an anti-Semitic majority, or I don't know the numbers exactly, uproar against Israel, completely disproportionate, completely one-sided, ignoring all kinds of other travesties, and that's Israel. So we have to deal with that. We have, obviously, the wars being battled in the countries in the Middle East, besides Hamas and Eretz Israel, but in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt, the world is up in flames. Not here to get now into a discussion of what our president and what America is about in this regard, but the question, so we clearly have a situation of dealing with non-Jews, and what should be our approach. So I discussed last week, at length, the Rebbe's position based on the Rambam and Hilchos Malachim, our attitude to non-Jews and so on. I want to continue this because there were a number of questions that were asked, but I want to begin with the rising anti-Semitism question, which, we don't even want to mention it. Can there be another Holocaust, God forbid? What does the Rebbe say? So let me address this. So we know today that there are two Yechidison where it appears from the Rebbe have being said to Herbert Wiener from 9.5 Mystics and to Swedos, who published that article about he could melt a blizzard in the New York Times that was published 20 years ago, approximately around Gimel Tammuz time, where the Rebbe makes reference that when he was asked the question, could there be another Holocaust? He said, tomorrow morning. Absolutely possible. Now these are Yechidus, which means there was only one person there, and that wasn't Berabim. I don't believe there's any Fabreng in the Rebbe such an alluding to something of that nature. On the contrary, there are quite a number of places that would suggest otherwise. So I'm not going to get into questioning what the Rebbe actually said and what was the context. The Rebbe could also be referring to the idea that there is enough anti-Semites and there's enough of that can allow that condition and situation. But you don't see inconsistently in the Rebbe's approach that we should be living in a paranoid state and keeping our heads low and being afraid that will happen, which is what many Jews have an attitude. Like, for example, the public menorahs. The Rebbe, of course, initiated it and fought for it, public menorahs. What was one of the arguments against it by even Jews? Jews should not be too public. Let's not get their attention. Let's not arouse. Let's not provoke. Which, if there's a fear of another Holocaust, can be a legitimate fear. Now, I'm not saying that there's a contradiction. You could have the fear or not the fear. You could know that it's possible and not have the fear. But you see from the Rebbe a very proactive approach with the non-Jewish world. He did not say, let's just protect ourselves, hide, or be a proud Jew and not be affected. But he went on an aggressive initiative, especially in the Tovshin Mems. The Rebbe went on an initiative that we should do everything possible to reach the non-Jews. Which brings me to a question that somebody asked. Now, and then I'll get back to the actual topic. Someone asked the question, condescension. Teaching the 7 mitzvahs of Noah to non-Jews is a condescending idea. This is what this fellow was writing. It's silly when a proselytizing Christian wants to tell Jews and other monotheists about the Lord. It's also silly when ultra-Orthodox Jews imagine they are going to teach the Gentile world about ideas that are integral to Christianity. People of faith can learn from each other, but only with respect, not condescension. And I should add, he writes, your book was very nice, but not quite as original as you think. Okay. So, I don't know who this is, because it's a confidential note. As you know that you can all post and submit your questions completely confidentially and anonymously at, I should mention this as an opportunity, where that can be done is at meaningfullife.com/mylifelive. So, I will respond just by what I read. First of all, it would be nice if you just added it's your opinion. In your opinion, because this is clearly based on a person's individual experience. Everything can be done in a condescending way, even the best things in life. You could have your best friend and you could speak condescending to that person and say, hey, here's a book that you must read. If you don't read this book, you'll never be a perfect person. Or you can say, hey, my friend, I really read a beautiful book. It's very inspiring. It inspired me. Why don't you try it out? So it all comes down to how you present. Absolutely not condescension. It's a responsibility. If you really care about somebody, you really care not just about yourself, why would you not share something that gave you insight? God forbid somebody went through a loss, and you find somebody that's not Jewish, went through a loss, and you know them in some way or another, at work, a friend, a doctor, however way, you meet them on a plane. Why not share with them something that may help them? And that's exactly what's incumbent upon us to do. So there's no condescension suggested. It's not about proselytizing. It's not about any type of patronizing. It's simply sharing and inspiring. And yes, an obligation that we, just like we share with other Jews, with our brothers and sisters, we share with our brothers and sisters that are not Jewish as well. I mean brothers and sisters in the figurative sense of the word. I'm not going to comment about whether my book is nice and as original as I think or not. First of all, I never made a statement how original it is. I'm not sure how you know what I think. Secondly, as a writer, I can just say, what you write, you put out to the public and let everyone decide on their own how original or not original it is. And frankly, if you read the introduction to my book, I actually said that the best compliment that you can give someone, a teacher, and I would say this about the Rebbe as well, is that if they tell you it's not original, it's ideas that I always knew, I just didn't have the words for it. So we're not looking for originality, we're looking here for resonance, we're looking for emes. And I hope my book tried to live up to that by conveying the Rebbe's ideas and message. And that I leave everyone else to decide on that, but I just didn't want to censor the letter, I wanted to read it fully. Now to go back to the topic, can there be another Holocaust? So, as I said, I did not hear from the Rebbe's words, he said, no, there cannot be. But I also didn't hear the other side except those Yechidison. And I should add, actually we did hear from the Rebbe that there cannot be another Holocaust when he brought a number of times where he said in Fabrengens, and he cited that we're on Mamash al Safa Gula, we're on the threshold of Gula, the world is ready, and all you have to do is open your eyes. So if there's a concern of another Holocaust, how could you say that? So I would submit, especially in the later years, it could be there was a time earlier that may be a different perspective. But in the late Mems and the early Nuns, it would seem an absolute contradiction to state that there could actually be another Holocaust, which means the non-Jewish world is capable of pulling that off, while saying that they're all ready, and all you have to do is open your eyes. And the Rebbe made it very clear when he said already, he meant the non-Jewish world. Didn't just mean the Jewish world. So that alone would imply that there cannot be. Did he say the words there cannot be another Holocaust? He said words that there will not be any more Hashmodes, Mishen Yetzig Ven Goyeg Mogeg, Mishen Yetzig Ven with what happened in the last generation, etc., etc. So yes, I would actually add, I'm correcting myself, that I would say based on those words the Rebbe actually said, there will not be. And so people say, one second, but people said that also earlier? Look, I'm not here to question the Rebbe says something, and Baruch Hashem Azeh the Matziv. There's no reason to second guess, and so on. Now let's go over to another question. We have in the Mitteler Rebbe, in the beginning of Shari Tshuva, the Mitteler Rebbe is a famous piece where he speaks about the Arizal, the time of the Arizal. He speaks and he says the language that all the hashmodas and the genocides and the killings that happened in the Middle Ages ended in the time of the Arizal. The lo yeh oid. They will no longer be. The Rebbe writes a number of places. He asks the Tzarachi and Gadol to cite exactly one of the places where the Rebbe brings it specifically. In the Sikha of, I believe it's Parsha Pinchas. Yes, Tavshin Lamed Ches. Motzei Shabbos Pinchas. Those Farbrengens were Motzei Shabbos for that period of time. The Rebbe says, Tzarachi and Gadol, what that means when we saw what happened in the last generation. So how could you say V'lo yeh oid? That there won't be any more of that. In a number of other places, the Rebbe also brings and discusses this. I just want to cite a few key things. In Tov Lamed Tes, there was an answer to Rabbi Munshine from Eretz Yisrael, the forsher, the scholar, where he asked the Rebbe, this is a note from him, Mitzvah Shabbos Keder Zocher, Tov Lamed Tes. He asked the Rebbe, he said that he heard that this actually, the answer from the Rebbe is printed in Likutei Sichos 30, chapter Chelik Lamed Ches, which means volume 38, page 183, only the Rebbe's answer. But he asked the Rebbe that he heard that the Rebbe asking a number of times, how do you explain the Shar Tshuva, that there will no longer, from the time of the Arizal, there was already, and there will no longer be any hashmodas, any genocides. Well, the fact is that we see there was the Holocaust. So he writes to the Rebbe, when you look at Shara Tshuva, doesn't it talk there about Gzeirah Shmad? We're talking about people, genocide that were perpetrated in order to convert the Jews. And if they converted, they were saved. Whereas in the last generation, he asked, there was no shmodus of that type. The Rebbe puts a question mark and two exclamation points and writes, Ha'omnum einu yedeya. Does he then not know that all the pogroms that were le'aleinu v'le'aleinu, the Rebbe said this will never happen again, in Russia and in Poland v'chulu, were only because of the religion? And the Rebbe says, in some places also Hitler, the Rebbe calls him here Gitler, that when you received a note from a Christian, you were saved. And some places they said clearly that a person who's ready to convert, they will not kill him. Even though the Rebbe says, Av shalei ba'ashkenaz, that not in Germany itself, that didn't happen. That's one thing the Rebbe writes. So in other words, what you're trying to tell me, that there's a distinction, that what the Shara Tshuva is saying is talking about events then, which were only connected to Shmad, which was conversion and so on in religion. And whereas now, so lo yeh, that won't happen again. But this type of Holocaust was a completely different thing. The Rebbe says absolutely not. So firstly, the pogroms he refers to, and the Holocaust also was absolutely connected to religion. And then the Rebbe adds, when you look inside the Shar Tshuva, the Rebbe refers to as the Geras HaTshuva, but it's the same idea. The Rebbe says it's not Negeya what the Goy thinks. The Goy, the who perpetrated this genocide. Because what he explains there is that what was the reason that those hashmodas will not happen again? He says there's a reason for it. Because the Churban Beis HaMikdash was due to Avodah Zarah. So therefore, the Jewish philosophers and thinkers of that time, who didn't remain rational, philosophical, but gave their lives not to convert, they gave their lives al Kiddush Hashem, that was a tikkun on the Churban Beis Bayis Rishon. And therefore, it doesn't matter why they were killed. The fact is they were killed for this purpose. And the same thing the Rebbe says about the Holocaust. Mefursim sherubim, that the Gzeiris during the time of the Holocaust were Kiddush Hashem. The Jews died on Kiddush Hashem. So it's basically, it doesn't matter what the intention is. the fact that they died. And he says, Lo Yeh, so why did this happen? The Rebbe then continues and says, there may be a consideration to answer that there in Shar Tshuva from Mitteler Rebbe, he's talking about the Tikkun Chet Aveda Zara. That's all. And that was finished with. But the Rebbe says, Gamze Deichig, this too is difficult to say because it's not the simple pshat Lo Yeh. Anyway, the bottom line is you see that the Rebbe is emphasizing and pushing that asking the big tzarech in Gadol why there was a Holocaust. Why is he pushing that? Why can't you just say it could happen any time? If you say, because you see that the Rebbe wants to make sure that it doesn't happen, and he's making clear that he's learning the Lo Yeh Kipshute, and it's a big question why it happened. So to suggest that could happen again would be opposite of the whole spirit of what the Rebbe is saying. Just for the complete picture, if you want more to look into this, you could also look in Tafshin Nun Aleph when the Rebbe spoke about whether it's a punishment. He made it very clear you can't say the Holocaust is a punishment, but it's a gzeira. And therefore, the Rebbe basically, he brings there the Shar Tshuva as well, and says from there you see that you cannot say that it's a punishment at all. And also, I would suggest to look at Chelik Chof Aleph, page 397, And finally, in the Iglis Kedesh of the Rebbe, volume 10, page Kuf Samach Tes, 169, he also talks about it, and also pushes away this answer. In addition, there's a note that he wrote to Rabbi Mangel, who also asked this question, and the Rebbe too there referred to that it's a Gilgal De'erishin. In other words, it's suggesting that answer, but ultimately the Rebbe doesn't accept the answer of the Bayis Sheni because it says Lo Yeh, and the Rebbe wants that to be Kipshute, which means that it will not happen again. Anyway, I felt it was very interesting to bring all of this, and let's move on now to continuing this discussion. Okay, thank you for addressing the next question, the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Neach in episode 30. That was last week. But I always struggle with the end of chapter 1 in Tanya where it discusses the loftiness of a Jewish neshama as opposed to others. Where he says clearly, Mashenkin u'mese'elam, nesham nefashas u'mese'elam, is gimekimel klippus atmeis, she'en lem tev klal, she'en bem tev klal. How do we understand this in context to looking at non-Jews? So it's an excellent question. The Rebbe in the Mems especially starts focusing on bringing Sheva Mitzvahs to all the non-Jews, based on the Rambam at the end of chapter 8 of Hilchos Malachim. How does that fit? When the Alter Rebbe says clearly in Tanya that the Gimel Klipsat Meis Ein Behem Tev Klal, and any Tev you do see, any good, is Ligramayu, the Yisyayer, for their own to serve themselves for their own good, etc. And we know Shalosh Klipsat Meis has to be completely annihilated and destroyed, not like Klippas Nega. Well, let's address this now. And we all know that Rabbi Hillel Paritcher brings in his beard and Kuntras his palace of the Mitteler Rebbe, he brings the name of the Alter Rebbe, that Chassidu Miselim is Menega, the Klippas Nega. Based on the Rebbe saying that the Geula is we're at the threshold of the Geula, and that all we have to do is open our eyes, and we have to bring Elokus to the Welt, including non-Jews, one would have to say that the Rebbe feels that we're at a place where all the non-Jewish world are at least in a potential state of Chassidu Miselim. And Lo Yesik Kol Elam El Ladasas Hashem B'Lvad. That will be, with the Rambam's words, at the end of Hilchos Malachim, when Mashiach comes, that will be the case. So you have to say that the Alter Rebbe is talking about the darga of Goyishkeit in Goyim. What do I mean by that? Ma'aseh Knani, Evdei Kechav Mazolos. A Goy, in the real sense of the Goy, is Shalosh Klippas Meis. But if a Goy takes upon himself, or maybe after all the generations of refinement, there becomes a collective change in Goyish consciousness, so to speak, in the Weltische consciousness, then they're capable of becoming Chassidu Miselim. Maybe they're not there yet, but we're at that stage where they could be. Again, I don't know how many. I've looked around the Sikhs. There's no numbers for it. But clearly everyone is in that potential state. So of course you're going to ask, how does that fit with ISIS and Hamas and others that are beheading people, etc., etc.? Well, you know something? Maybe if we send the right message and we were very adamant about it and very passionate about it, which we'll soon address as well, I'm not saying I'm not being naive, but maybe if we took the lead, maybe we could affect even them as well. And I'll address the Muslims in a minute. But the point I want to make here is that the Tanya Perek Aleph remains intact. As a matter of fact, there's a zettel where the people ask the Rebbe whether they should skip over certain parts of Tanya when they're teaching it in English because it'll bring up too many questions, etc. And the Rebbe says absolutely mufrach, absolutely not. And yet at the same time, because the emes of what says in Tanya remains. And the Rebbe actually says in one of those places where he says about should we skip parts of Tanya, the Rebbe says to go to a Pashut Chassidic Shaid and ask him. Why? Because there's nothing to be ashamed of. I remember once speaking somewhere, in Woodstock it was, and after my talk, a guy gets up and says, you speak very beautifully, it's very presentable, so on, but you choose to selectively ignore certain things in Chassidus. So I saw where he's going. He says, how do you explain the end of chapter 1 of Tanya, the attitude to non-Jews? And he had a follow-up question, and he said, does anybody ever ask that question of you? So I said to him, yes, your second question answers your first question. People do ask me this question, but it's only Jews that ask this question. I never get the question from non-Jews. Jews have some type of inferiority complex and some paranoia, whatever it may be, in regesh nechitut, they call it in Hebrew, and there's a chip on the shoulder that we don't like what it says there. But if you read it properly, you may not think it to be quite as radical as it may sound initially. So yes, the Jews have the problem with it. There are millions of Christians in America that travel to Israel, especially now, that say the Jews are the chosen people, and this is their promised land, and not 1 inch of the land should be given up. Why don't they have a problem with that? So let me just say the following. There's a letter that I was going to read, at least excerpts of it, a very powerful letter, where the Rebbe says, and I just want to read one section from it. This is a letter from Tovshin Lamed Daled. It's in English, Rish Chedesh Tevis. It talks about Israel in general. But I want to say one thing, and then maybe I'll refer to it in another part of this episode. The Rebbe is talking about Eretz Yisrael and what we can do. So he says, as for the practical thing which Jews everywhere can do to help the present situation, he means in Israel, something which is most regrettably ignored, in line with playing down the obvious divine intervention in the most critical days of the war, he's talking about the Yom Kippur War, is that every Jew must strengthen his bonds with the Torah from Sinai when God made us this chosen people. This is the Rebbe's words now. This is also something of which we need not be ashamed. For contrary to those who misunderstand and misrepresent this in terms of privilege, which smacks of chauvinism, the Rebbe writing, this chosenness is primarily a matter of duty and obligation to be a model people for the whole world to emulate. A people where form takes precedence over matter, the spiritual over the material, and the soul over the body. A people which was destined to be a light unto the nations, Isaiah 42:6, etc. It is this kind of life and conduct which the Torah describes that also stimulates right thinking and the proper outlook on life. It is this kind of life that also strengthens the self-confidence of every Jew, wherever he may be, and enables him to shed any inferiority complex and the readiness to be impressed by a goy or by an idea which comes from a goy, or actually non-Jewish ideology. It is sad indeed when instead of being a model and a living example for non-Jews to emulate, some Jews fall over themselves to emulate non-Jews, rejecting the spring of living waters, the Jewish Torah and Jewish tradition, etc. The Rebbe then continues on with psychological implication of that. He says, I should read it already. It is surely unnecessary to point out to you, an MD, the psychological factor which has such an important role when two adversaries confront each other. When the adversary sees that his opponent is spiritually and psychologically strong and self-confident, and certain of his just cause, and not prone to be impressed by the adversary or any non-Jew due to the inferiority complex mentioned above, this is the best way of preventing wars, not only major wars, but even wars of attrition. It is hardly to be expected that a Jew who in his personal life is afraid to show that he is a proud Jew, whether at home or outside, who prefers to stack his library with non-Jewish volumes and authors, etc., and who makes sure to bring up his children in a way that when they walk in the street, they should show no signs of being Jewish, yet this same Jew should draw the line and take a different posture when he meets a political adversary and engages in political negotiations with representatives of other countries. Could such a Jewish representative truly consider himself at least equal to the Gentile adversary in such a confrontation, having tried all his life to emulate and follow slavishly the Gentile world and way of life? You get the idea. So at the end of chapter 1 in Tanya, let's talk about it for a moment. Without any cheshbenis, as a Pashat Chassidic, is it possible that the Alter Rebbe and Torah in general, first of all, Pedekal, what the Alter Rebbe quotes from Eitz Chaim and from Gemara, Chesed Lum Chatas, is not his original writing. Not one word there is original at the end of Pedekal. So let's make it clear it's not a Psat Tanya thing. The Alter Rebbe explains it and he uses it. And he writes at the end of Perek Aleph, it's not buried somewhere later. Is it possible that the Torah's Chesed, which Adam Arishan created, and it says, Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem, it's a Mishnah, which is referring to non-Jews, because afterwards it says Chvivin Yisrael, and then Chvivin Yisrael Shekiblu, that Nitn Lehem Klei Shor is the Torah. Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem. The Alter Rebbe should hold that suddenly Goyim are what, trash? God forbid. God created them. B'Tselem Elikim. Now, but then, the whole purpose of life is there's a thing called Goyishkeit. Goyishkeit means Elam Hazeh Hagashmi V'Achumri, which manifests in nations like Avram Avinu. Mi Yitin Toyer Mitame. He came from a pagan world. And Mamata Lamayli, he searched for God. From a Goyish world, he created a world of spirituality, a godly world, and ultimately became Av HaMoin Goyim, teaching it to everyone, and his children, and not children afterwards, Be'em Banav, Be'esei Achrav, Lasses Daka and Mishpat, until his children and grandchildren were Zeicha to receive the Torah, Matan Torah. And we know the Torah was given not just for the Jews, it was given, like the Rambam Paskins in the end of Perek Ches of Hilchos Melachim, that also to teach morality, like the Rebbe says here, to be a role model. So chosenness is chosen to be a role model, to be a light unto nations. Something to be ashamed of. On the contrary, the greatest mission in life. And when the Eibishter went to Bnei Yishmael and Bnei Esav to give them the Torah, it wasn't, as we discussed in the last episode, a trick. It was because they ultimately are children of Avram. They are the ancestors of most of the world today, maybe all the world when you count Bnei Keturah, the Kedem, that are also children of Avram, Bnei Hagar, etc., Bnei Keturah. And why? Because ultimately all the children of Avram Avinu will embrace God's message, each in their own way. So hence the obligation of Sheva Mitzvahs B'neiach is to reveal the Tzelem Elokim, the divine image that every non-Jew was created. Because that's where they originate. That is the way Goyishkeit began. Pagans, Evdei Aveda Zarah, which Aveda Zarah is everything antithetical to God. But if a Goy accepts and embraces Avram's approach and eliminates Aveda Zarah from his life, and eliminate that, he's called Chassidic U'Maseilam, and therefore he's Klippas Nega. And when the Rambam says, Mola Aretz Deis Hashem, the world will be filled with divine knowledge, he's talking about a Goyish world. Obviously, that's not Sholosh Klippas Atmeis and Evdei Aveda Zarah. It doesn't go hand in hand that they're Ladasas Hashem Bolvad, Oz Epech Elamim, Beisi Zu, Beisi Tfilah L'Kol Ha'amim, they're coming to the Beis HaMikdash and see that as their house of prayer, etc., and all the nevuos. So the Alter Rebbe knew, of course, all of this, Pashat Mitzad his own lumdus, and yet he talks about it because the nefesh, the nefoshes, where they originate from, each one originates. The nefesh habamis of a Yid in Klippas Nega, the nefesh habamis of a non-Jew in Sholosh Klippas Atmeis, and then he says the good they do is only for themselves. Let me ask you something. The Rambam Paskins from Kedushin, Masechta Kedushin, Le'elim Yaseh Godem B'Torah Mitzvah Shalei Lishma, Shemetech Shalei Lishma Bo Lishma. He says only one man, Avram Oyevi, did something Oisas Emes Mepnei Shu Emes, for no ulterior motive. Everyone does everything Le'elam for ulterior motive. How is that different than Le'gramayu? So there's all kinds of explanations. That the B'nefesh Habamis, it does it taka for yourself, but it's not completely for yourself. There is also for the good of it. There's different explanations on the explanation, but You see, it's not such a simple matter. In the Gramaya itself, there are many reasons. You could do something. Someone gives dukkah to get covered. Isn't that lisyayir? So does that not go in the same category of chesed l'umim chatas? Just trying to point out how when you start looking into it, it's more complicated than just saying this one's good, this one's not. And the Lashon Ein Be'em Teiv Klal, by the way, the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Rasha make it very clear. Ein Be'em Teiv Klal Ba'atzmusam, meaning mitzad atzmam. Like Shlosh Klipos Atmeis, everything has a spark of the divine. The question is, if the spark is like Chaticha Nas Nevela, and therefore became completely like a black hole swallowed up by the dark, but you have to say there's always Teiv. I'm not going to get into the dynamic, how does somebody go over from Shlosh Klipos Atmeis to Chsidu Meseilam. There isn't a lot of biyurim in this Chassidus, Bagoyim. It talks about it a bit. We could talk about tshuva, how a person does tshuva in Perek Zayin and Tanya, how Osir B'Yidei Chitzenim, and then you turn it into Shlosh Klipos Atmeis through tshuva. But that's after the fact. With non-Jews, it's probably not quite like that. And we have to also remember that the non-Jewish world has been refined over hundreds of years, and we live in a far more humane world. So that is number one. Two more things I want to say about Sof Perek Aleph of Tanya. Again, I refer to the Ha'ara of the Rebbe in Likutei Sichos, volume 13, page 230. I also refer to you to look there where he brings all kinds of rayos. It's the Gemara that says that Esek Ha'akum She'esek B'Teira is Kohen Gadol Shenichnas L'Fnei L'Fnim. He's considered like a high priest going in the inner chambers. The Gemara, Rashi explains, it means Sheva Mitzvahs Didhu. But still learning Torah. Not in the Torah, that's not shaykh to him. So you see that how does that stem with all that we're talking about? Because there's a b'chira there too. And non-Jews also have b'chira, v'arayah there's char v'einish. Different type of b'chira, different level of b'chira, however you want to explain it. And of course the Mishnah said, Chaviv Adam Shenivir B'Tzalan. Two more things I'd like to point out is in Likutei Sichos, volume 15, a Noyach Sicha about Akum Sheshavas Chayev Misa. Beautiful Sicha, the Rebbe explains that why would non-Jews not allowed to keep Shabbos? Shabbos reminds us of God, as the Chinuch writes. Not only they're not allowed to keep it, you say if they keep it, they're Chayev Misa. What's wrong with keeping it? And there's even questions whether they're allowed to keep it on Sunday. The Kitzur, the Rebbe's answer is, Goyim are Mamala Kalam. Their job is L'Sheves Yitzhara, Adam L'Omer Yavolad, to transform this world. So what means one day you take off? Eden, because Eden have an addition to the Mamala Kalam and an element of Sevav Kalam, which is they bring in a Elokus that's higher than Welt, that's Shabbos. Each plays their role. So just like for a Jew, it's a mitzvah to work 6 days of the week, he can't say I can keep Shabbos 6 days of the week. As a matter of fact, it says in the Sifri, it's a mitzvah sesa, Sheishes Yom Tasim Alachtacha. You can't sit around bottle. So for a non-Jew, it includes also the seventh day. What do you see from this? That take away Eved Zara, take away the Shalosh Klipos Atmeis, a non-Jew has a role to play. The role is to transform this world and bring Elokus. Elokus, Sheirish HaNivroim, Elokus L'Fi Erech however you want to explain it. And on the other hand, there's another thing to bring in Hecher Favelt, Elokus that's higher than the world. And it's not mutually exclusive. Because as the Rambam, the Alter Rebbe brings in Teireh, the Rebbe brings that in Likutei Sichos there, and Chelik Yud Gimel, that there were philosophian people who dedicate their entire life to muskolas and to spirituality. So you can have a Sevu Kalam even by a non-Jew, and you have a Malak Kalam by a Jew. V'araya, we also work. We're also part of this world. So when he speaks in the Rambam, Lo Ye'esu Ka'elam El Adasa Shashem Bolvad, you could say for non-Jews primarily Malak Kalam. But Malak Kalam is Ganza Feina Madrege. It's Elokus, Havayu Hu Elokim. There's no two gods. It's God manifesting in the structure of existence. Elokim Gematria HaTeva. And then there's higher. And remember, they obviously speak to each other. So you can't say it's completely two different worlds. However, there's Hamavdil ben Yisrael Amim. The Hamavdil on this level is not necessarily between Shalosh Klipos Atmeis and Klipos Nega. It could be the Klipos Nega of Chassidim Meseilim and the Klipos Nega of Jews, because they have different roles. In a pure world where you don't have Avodah Zarah anymore, and you don't have Shalosh Klipos Atmeis behavior, and you have a moral, ethical world, there's also a distinction between Jew and non-Jew. Nothing wrong with that. Just like there's a distinction between Kohanim, Levim, and Yisraelim. So I would say that in the earlier generations, Goyishkeit was the dominant feature was Shalosh Klipos Atmeis, because that's the world that they lived in, pagans, and so on. But in the later generations, as the world became more refined, the non-Jewish world has moved more to its natural Mamala Kalam state, which is Adam Arishon B'Tselem Elokim, Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem. Jews elevate to more of a Seviv Kalaman place. And obviously there's more work to be done. But this is an attitude, an approach that can tell us that we're on the direction and close to the Geula itself. And the Tanya Perek Aleph will be taught and learned even after Geula, Mashiach comes. We're not going to censor and say, the Alter Rebbe writes in Perek Zayin and Tanya Belam obviously Natzach, that there will no longer be Shalosh Klipsat Meis when Mashiach comes. Are we going to learn Perek Zayin and Tanya? Chaz v'shalom to say not. It's the same Tanya. It's Torah. Will we learn Hilchos Avodah Zarah in Rambam? Will we learn about Avodah Zarah in Chumash? Torah zu nitzchis. However, it may not be applicable, like the Rebbe speaks about mitzvahs ptelis, it may not be applicable in action because you don't have that situation. Or you can say, Beruchni is there's always a dakas dika Avodah Shazar Alei, or some type of spiritual version as you climb. A b'gut is besin is besis, or compared to a higher madrega, like the Alter Rebbe says at the end of Igeres HaKedesh, Simen Chavov. What will be once there's no more Tumah and Tada? What will we learn? Why are we learning? There'll be aliyas in Kedusha itself. These halachas, she'll have to explain them, just like Istakel Baraisa Bara Alma and Teda Kodma Le'elam. However, the Teda includes Tumah and Tada and Movis, as the Zohar asks. Before creation, that's how it will be lost at Lovi. So we'll learn about Goyim, we'll learn about Shlosh Klippos Atmeis, but we'll learn about it as either as a concept or as a Dakas Dika level that compared to a higher level, this is Shlosh Klippos, however you explain it. So we're anyway going to have to come and explain the whole state of the non-Jewish people. And when these non-Jews are sitting and learning Chassidus, and they're learning Mola Ores Deis Hashem, and they're open up a Tanya Seif Perek Aleph, they'll probably explain to us what it means. So you have to understand the concept, and then you have to understand its application in each period of time. Okay. More can be said, and I'm sure there's plenty of controversy as it is, and I'm sure, I hope to get questions from you and rebuttals and so on, and keep it coming. So are we afraid of raising anti-Semitism? My answer, short, briefly, is yes, we're aware of it, not afraid of it. But the Rebbe makes it very clear in the letter I read from Tov Shalom Dalet that we have to, Adarabah, this is the time where we have to show example. We have to be a living role model. Okay, but then the question becomes, what do we do? Fine, that's fine. You can say the Christian Western world, like the United States of America, is based on the principles of all men are created equal. There are inalienable rights. Much of the Western world is based on these principles. Yes, there's individual anti-Semitism, but on an institutional level, governments, you can sue someone for being anti-Semitic. You know? And even in Russia, President Putin happens to be kind to Jews, but there is a certain sensitivity that didn't exist 50, 60, 100 years ago. Can that change? Can legislation change? I've never seen from the Rebbe afraid that the United States is going to change its laws about religious freedom regarding Jews. Everything can, but based on our march toward Geula, based on the refinement that has been going on, there's no reason to accept that, no reason to be afraid of it. But we have to do a job. Not only shouldn't we be ashamed, we should be standing and being leaders of morality. We should be the shining role models of what it means to be a godly person in the world. The Rebbe's words, they're tremendous. He says to be a model of what? Of a nation that sees, that emulates, a people from where they take precedence of spirit. Form takes precedence over matter. The spiritual over the material and the soul over the body. To teach the world what it means to be a refined human being. Now, are you going to ask, what do we do now with the Muslim world? This is fine, you can say with the Christian world, or the Western world, American world, however you. What do we do in Muslim world? We're seeing beheadings, we're seeing behavior that goes back to the Middle Ages, savagery and so on. So let's talk about the amendment. What is the Rebbe's attitude to that? So firstly, if you go to all these answers I've already cited and others, the Rebbe sees this, like Chassidus says, from the Zohar, Seif Parsha Ve'era and Bolok, as part of the final birur, the birur of Yishmael. If Yishmael is perhaps now where the Christians were in the 15th century, the 16th century. Not that we have to wait 3-4 more centuries, but it's a stage. Because they're saying it in the name of God. Now, I never heard from the Rebbe dismissing Muslims. On the contrary, I heard from different Askonim. In Washington, they once established something. Rabbi Shem Tov told me this. And they said it was a Christian Judeo so-called project. And the Rebbe said that he should work and make sure to include the Muslims in it. If the Muslims are all fanatics and they're middle-aged savages, well, the Rebbe would never say that. On the contrary, halachically, we know actually that Islam is closer to monotheism than Christianity in some ways. And the Rambam says very clearly in the section that's censored at the end of chapter 11, Hilchos Malachim, what does he say? He says that both Christianity and Islam, even though he calls him what he calls him, it came by Hashgacha L'Yena, B'Seidus, whatever, the mysteries of God's ways, to pave the world toward the Geul. And the Muslims then were not exactly more refined than they were today. So you have to say there's a distortion of how they're using the beliefs of Abraham. And they're using Torah in a distorted way. I don't want to even compare it, but lahavdil elef havdolas. Bedakas the dakas. Rashbi comes out of the Maida, comes out of hiding after 12 years. You can imagine how refined he was. So the Gemara says wherever he looked at, began to burn. So the Eibusha said, you're not ready to come out. Because he saw the pettiness, the materialism, the superficiality of life. It just began to burn, physically, spiritually, however. The Eibusha said, you're not ready yet. Go back a 13th year, bar mitzvah. Then he came out and says everything, wherever he went, he repaired. Which is a higher spiritual level? To burn the world up with your spiritual state, or to refine? The answer is obvious. I am not comparing lahavdil of havdalas, but there's an element of religion when it's not properly balanced, when there's chesed without the balance of gvura, yishmol without gvura, or gvura without chesed, where it gets radical and it can destroy the world. So I am not in any way suggesting that these ISIS and others are on the level of such spirituality that they're burning the world. There's no question that it's feeding into their savagery, into their bestiality, into the lowest common denominator and the most most inferior part of what a human being can stoop beneath, even being human. But the distortion of the thinking that God wants, that infidels and idol worshippers or devil worshippers, as they put it, should be beheaded, that coming the distortion on the spiritual level is because there's a distortion of the whole meaning of religion. So what does the Rebbe have to say about this? So there's an interesting yichidus that the Rebbe had in 1980. It's now in video, in audio actually, where the Rebbe had in 1980 with Moti Eden. He was a broadcast journalist for Kol Yisrael, Israel Radio, and later he became a director of Israel's Channel 1 television. What does the Rebbe say there? He asked the Rebbe that he sees that the Rebbe is putting a lot of emphasis. It was the beginning of Tzivus Hashem, Tavshin Mem. A lot of emphasis on rallies for children. And he's wondering why, and especially in times of crisis, he sees that the Rebbe does that. Crisis in Israel and so on, putting emphasis on the children. The Rebbe's answer is mind-blowing. And we hear the audio. There's an audio of the Rebbe's Yechidus. He speaks in Hebrew. Briefly, the Rebbe says like this, that I want to firstly begin that we don't like to make havchadas, which I want to emphasize here as well, because Ivdus Hashem b'simcha, so we're not trying to frighten anybody, and everything has to always be done with positive note. But the Rebbe says, according to the Yedias, the intelligence I'm receiving from Washington, and Washington today is a place where all the intelligence comes through Washington, is that there's a major shift going on in the Muslim world. He says, years ago, the Rebbe says 10 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever, who ruled the Muslim world? It was sheiks. They were the leaders. And you could buy them off. You could buy them off with money, you can buy them off with a good car, and so on. And the youth followed along. So you're able to control them to some extent by buying them off. So today what's happening is that the young Muslims, this is 1980, long before the Arab Spring. What are we talking? We're talking here 20, 30, 34 years ago. 1980, 1999, 2000. Yeah. The Rebbe says the shift is happening. The young Muslims today are becoming more and more fanatics. The Rebbe used the word fanatics than their parents and grandparents. And they cannot be bought off. That's what's happening. And then the Rebbe compares it. He says, and by Jews, the opposite is happening. Whereas once there was a spirit of chalutzim, people, pioneers, the settlers, to transform and to be pioneers in Israel. Now the youth are losing that, and they say, just leave me alone. Let me be at peace. Let me be quiet. Exact opposite of what's going on. So the Rebbe says, so I feel the need to instill in the youth the passion again. That's why we gather Jewish children together, here and in Israel, and everywhere where there are Jews. And what do? We say, Shema Yisrael. We're telling you, you're not just of this generation. You are a nation that goes back 20, 30 generations. And when the Rebbe said Shema Yisrael, and Shema Yisrael, it didn't just mean Yisrael then. The Rebbe says Moshe, Shleimeh, I think he says Yitzchak. Today, says Shema Yisrael. You're connected to all of that. To instill in Jews the sense of pride, their connection to the Eibishter, to Torah, and of course to Yisrael. What is the Rebbe saying here? That unfortunately they have become more passionate and fanatic, where money and materialism can't buy them off, and tragically by the Jews the exact opposite, becoming more complacent and more apathetic. And we have to reconnect, because without passion you're not going to beat them. He doesn't say these words, but it's an obvious statement. And I brought it also a few weeks ago from Purim Tavshei Chav Hei. When there's passion in a Geb and Nefesh, you can beat big armies. When it's a piseichel, you're going rationally, you have a strong army and you're rational and so on. I'm not talking about being irrational, but there has to be a passionate connection. You're fighting for our holy land. It's obscene to say. Americans are not natives of this country. They killed the Native Americans. A number of years ago, if you remember, Great Britain sent a flotilla, sent armies to go secure the Falkland Islands that Argentina was claiming, and it's not even the mainland of Britain. That's what they did. Israel, a nation that is here for thousands of years, connected to this land, where's that passion? The passion should be stronger than any Muslim passion. And they would respect that. And now I'm quoting from other places, but that's the Yechidus I wanted to refer to. You go back to that letter, Tov Shalom Medal, the Rebbe says basically the same thing. He says that we are in control of our own destiny. And we can do whatever it is that we are capable of doing. So you have to have that connection in that level. So are we afraid of Muslim fanaticism? No, we're not afraid of it. As a matter of fact, everything has a lesson. We have to learn from the passion. Obviously, it's an obscene one, and it's misplaced. But remember, even the most distorted, misplaced, and perverted passion beats rational mediocrity, rational apathy. If you're apathetic, if you're rational and apathetic, there's no match to someone who's irrational and passionate. We have to turn it into a passion. The netzach and hoid, the determination and the hoid and the commitment of a passion, a commitment and a passion that is beyond anything that they achieve. So that's the answer. We have to take the lead, and we have to develop an approach that will supersede and overpower what they have to achieve. Now, because time is limited, and I wanted to cover more subjects, as usual, it doesn't work out, but so be it. So I want to just conclude in the last few minutes that we have with the Rebbe's directives for the month of Elul. And it's not a new subject even. Everything's Ashgacha Pratis. All these events really exploded basically in Tammuz and Av, in the Saturdays leading through Tisha B'Av. Elul, as we discussed, is an outgrowth of Aryeh, Rosh Hashanah, Elul, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Tishrei Rabbah. It's an outgrowth of all of that. And Elul, I want to go over some of the Rebbe's Heiros about Elul because it has impact not only in our personal lives but also on the events in Eretz Yisrael. And the topics that I have not been able to cover here, I will, please God, cover in the coming episodes. But I thought this discussion was very important, so I want to just discuss a few things about the Heiros of Elul. Okay. So, first of all, we all know the Melech Basod analogy that the Rebbe gives, the Alter Rebbe gives in Likutei Torah Re'eh, asking the question why is Elul not a month of holidays? It should be a month of holidays because it's the Gili of the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim. We know a holiday is basically a Gili of a higher presence. So why is the whole Elul not a month of holidays? So he gives the mashal. The Melech in the holidays, the Melech Behechel is when he's coming back, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the high holidays. But he's on a journey back to the palace. On his way into the palace, before he reaches there, he greets and meets the people of the field. So we have the Melech in the field. So Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim is in the field, which means Yimei HaChel. And this is an opportunity to go and ask the king anything you want. You have access. So this mashal reigns supreme in the Rebbe's words about Elul, to know that we have a special opportunity as we enter the month of Elul. It's easier to access and easier to communicate. And how do we do so? There's the famous 5 Rosh Tevas the Rebbe speaks about Elul, starting with Anila Deidi V'Deidi Li, self-initiative. And the Rebbe says these 5 correspond to the 5 foundations. First of all, the 3 pillars upon which the world rests, Teira, Aveda, Gemilas Chasadim, to add in study of Teira, to add in Zdaka, and to add in davening. In some places it says, the Rebbe cites, they should actually, some people minimize less learning and more davening, more tefillah, tachnunim. The other 2 Rosh Tevas, one is tshuva. Tshuva is return, not just repent, reconnecting to our source. And the final, geula, the emphasis on geula. These are the 5 Rosh Tevas. The Rebbe speaks about, therefore, adding, increasing in all those kavim, in Aveda. What else can we say? There's obviously also, everything is done b'simcha. The Rebbe focuses a lot about the simcha that should be done during this period of time. And obviously, Ahavas Yisrael. The minhag is to start writing in our letters, Ksiv v'Chsim Teva. Some start Tu B'Av, but definitely from Rosh Chodesh Elul. But that it's not just signing a nice message, but it's a attitude of Ahavas Yisrael. So it's an opportunity to connect. Now tell me, is this not most relevant today? In a world where there's such anti-Semitism, where there's what's going on in Eretz Yisrael, Jews being attacked just because they're Jewish, what's going on in other parts of the world, this is the time where we have to just rise to the occasion and put aside our differences, especially petty ones, and say, you know something? There's something more important in life than my own little cheshbonus. And this is the month to do so. Let's see, any other things that I would focus on? I'm sure there's more, but we'll focus on more. We're going to be in month of El next week as well. So let me conclude with a bracha, ksiv v'chsim teva, l'shana teva mesukah, for every Jew everywhere, both here, both in Eretz Yisrael especially, it needs a special bracha, and it has a special bracha, because Eini Hashem Elokecha bo mereishis hashana v'ad achrei shana. As the Alter Rebbe brings in Siman Yudalad in the Geras HaKedesh, that refers to achrei shana, reishis hashana refers to this time of year, the end of the year, going into Rosh Hashanah, where a new Er Chodesh, a new opportunities, a new power of Shalom, of Achdus, and eliminating all this tzaddus and tzad and pain and fears and running, etc., will be eliminated, and should be Shalom in the whole world, not just to the Jewish world, to the entire world. Al Medinas Bo Yomer, we pray for all the nations, and all the nations are infected by how we behave. So the Eibusher should help us all, that we should use this time well, both in our personal Aveda, and that itself will spill over from Elam Kotten Zeh Adam, the human being the small universe, to spill over to the entire world. That it should finally be before the end of the year, before even Rosh Chodesh Elul, should be a complete peace, a real peace, a permanent peace, but only with strength, one that brings God into the world and understands how to balance faith, passion, and loving one another. As Avraham Avinu prayed for infidels, he didn't behead them, he didn't kill them, Rahman al-Islam. So we should only have peace and we should only have good news. So until next week, this has been My Life Chassidus Applied, episode 31. Next week again, from 8 to 9. I look forward. And please send in your questions to meaningfullife.com/MyLifeLive. Anonymous and confidential. If you want to write to me personally, write to Simon, S-I-M-O-N, @meaningfullife.com. This has been My Life Chassidus Applied, episode 31. Everyone should have a very blessed week.